Yo, parish orphans and retrogrades, happy Lenten Friday, a solemn Lenten Friday. Remember not to eat meat today. I'm on a 4-hour fast. A fast until 4 p.m. Won't eat meat. Make sure to keep your Lenten Fridays solemn, people. Parish orphans and retrogrades. Toward the end of chastening and hopefully hastening our Lent, I brought on my friend Stephen Jonathan Rummelsburg, who's an education guru, to talk about not so much education particulars to how to homeschool or anything like that, but the structural barriers to true learning that have really arisen since the Protestant Reformation in the modern world. And we're going to go through 7 of them today, but I will introduce you right now, Steve. Thanks for coming on. People have seen you before. You run the City of Truth YouTube channel, and it's an up-and-coming Catholic channel for all people who want to know about the particulars of education and the kind of, like we're doing today, the general philosophic, pedagogical struggles that people go through just to see clearly. Steve, what's up, man? How are you?
That's right. Hey, Tim, thanks for having me on again. It's great to be here as usual and to talk about City of Truth and an authentic Catholic education. I want to begin with a couple premises that I think are really important to understand, because we've been looped into talking about education in a way that's not very tied to reality. So I want to begin with a couple stipulations, and feel free to push back on these, because either they're true or they're not true. The claim at City of Truth is that modern education is theoretically bankrupt. That means beyond the particulars and practicalities, the ideas and principles undergirding the modern school are diametrically opposed to an authentic education. Do you grant point one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you're talking school.
Yeah,
like if people are
theoretically.
still,
Yeah,
people know on this channel, if you're still sending your kids to school,
yeah,
then that's just a presupposition that we have. Don't send your kids to school.
that's right.
Homeschool them. They're not going to get, whether it's called a Catholic school or a public school. Of
That's
course,
right.
the model is John Dewey and curricula, and it's all based on de-Hellenization. It's something I'll talk about maybe after you do a couple of these points. All 7 of Steve's points here today, people, are based on 3 centralizing moments of de-Hellenization in that have taken place since the Protestant Reformation, and I'll tell you what those are. But of course, everything you're saying, Steve, applies with full force anytime you're farming out your own education or your kids' education from kindergarten through grad school.
That's right. Yeah. And so if that's the given, we got to recognize John Dewey as the synthesis of all intellectual and moral errors in the modern school. He's the guy. He takes all the Enlightenment errors, brings them all together, and completely destroys education. That's a bold statement, but we can prove it over the next 5 years. The second thing I want to say, and this is applicable to your audience who is so good precisely because of what you said. Here's the tricky part. Most classical and homeschooling endeavors out there are also theoretically bankrupt despite appearances. This is the tricky part, is that all these errors have been conditioned into us, and unwittingly, we may not understand that. Now, that doesn't mean that practically, when you keep your kids home, you can't do better than that. And practically, great things happen at home. And there's things that Dewey can't account for, like love and reality and all the freedom that you have at home with your kids. So it's all good stuff. So we're going to limit this conversation just to the theoretical roadblocks to an authentic education. And I've learned this with working with a lot of people, is that most of us are just conditioned into the wrong answers, even though notionally we have the right positions. That's the starting point.
Sure. So we're going to go through 7 of these, right, Steve?
Yes.
Seven
Yeah.
7 roadblocks to being able to learn. It's not even just education. Am I in a classroom? It's being able to, as a rational agent with an intellect, have my intellectus adequate ratios, natures properly. And that's what God set our intellects up to do.
That's
is
right.
our natural reason to apprehend the natural world.
That's right. And to conform the mind to reality.
Right.
That's really what it's all about. So in a nutshell, this is really helpful. There's a guy named George Bernanos, and I found this quote by him that summarized something, Tim, you taught me 10 years ago. I'll never forget the day we were standing in my living room. We were talking about the problems in the modern world, and you enlightened me with the truth that to understand the Enlightenment and modernity, you had to understand that it was a complete rejection and denial of natural ends, final cause, and formal cause, essences and natures. That rejection makes our thinking in the modern world purely material. And this is a huge problem. So there's this beautiful quote by George Bernanos that summarizes what Tim taught me 10 years ago. And it goes like this: you understand absolutely nothing about modern civilization unless you first admit that it is a universal conspiracy against all interior life. And that interior life is what the education is all about.
Yes. And that's why I keep trying to stretch, pull, broaden your definition of education. I don't even think you're resisting it. I just want in the mind of the listening parish orphan or retrograde out there, we're not just talking about homeschool, classroom in grade school, middle school, high school, college. I literally mean there's a conspiracy out for your mind. The agency, the conspiracy is the devil, but he and the powers and principalities use the princes of this world and their worldly power in this conspiracy against your mind in order to make sure that he stops up your proper seeing. You know, your intellect is clouded by sin and things like that. But this became especially potent in the modern age. Think, last 500 years.
Exactly right.
Yeah,
exactly
you have
right.
7 of them, right, Steve?
Yeah, 7 quick ones. And this is not exhaustive at all. This is just the very beginning. And your audience is going to be really in tune with all of them notionally, but we have to be a little bit suspicious about how we've been conditioned. So it's great to have an interior examination about these things and notice how they manifest in our conversations. It's really, really important. So the first one is this. We have to ask and answer the question, does objective truth exist and can we know it? It sounds so simple, but the modern school says no. They make the objective truth claim that we can't know reality really. And this ends in subjectivism, eventually skepticism and solipsism. So it's an easy one for our audience, but we have to consider this because sometimes we say, in my perspective, by my point of view, when we speak and share things rather than this is how it is in reality. So
Right.
we say yes to objective truth exists and we were made to know it. This is really foundational and firm, and our answer has to be yes to those two things. What do you think, Tim?
I was discussing some liturgical trivia with E. Michael Jones on Twitter, and he was saying something, too many trads talk about people who attend the Novus Ordo as if they're second-class Catholics. And I said, I agree with you. There are no second-class Catholics. There is a second-class liturgy, though. It has nothing to do with the attendance of either the TLM or the Novus Ordo. But I said, objectively, even though there are no second or first-class Catholics, depending on which liturgy you attend, there is an objective beauty that's indisputably higher to the TLM. And EMJ responded with something really curious. I mean, I was ceding a lot of his point, but he said there are no objective like true value claims or something, or what he said, something like that. And I'm like, that this is modernism. I responded, this is pure modernism, that there's no objectivity to beauty claims is really what he meant. And beauty is objective. It's not in the eye of the beholder. The world and all of its invisible properties, namely the 3 Platonic transcendentals, beauty, goodness, unity, and also truth. These things are objective. But the modern world, this seems to be the big one. The modern world has made, I mean, the last 500 years, it's made conservatives to think that beauty is subjective, that it's in the eye of the beholder. They'll throw that postmodern garbage at you, and you're like, no, it's specifically not. The Bible
That's right.
says no. The ancient world, the Greek world says no. We have a golden standard for proportion and things like that. The Romans said no. It's the modern world that rejects it.
That's right. No, that's absolutely right. And a great example of where do they go first? To the heart of the matter. Satan and the minions, if they can get us to be subjective about beauty, everything else follows. So we have to be really careful of that. Beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. But that's a great point. Excellent example of, E. Michael Jones doesn't want to be a modernist.
Right.
And yet we've been conditioned that way. So once we say yes to objective truth and those transcendentals, those realities, then we ask the question about the first principle of all reality. And that is, can a thing be and not be the kind of thing it is in the same time, in the same way? That's a very rude reduction of it. But the easier one is it true or is it not true? It can't be both. And this is something the modern world rejects as well. There is no truth in the modern school. There's only the rules. And we've been conditioned into saying, well, you've got your perspective, I've got mine. And if we disagree, we can have our own truth. How often do we hear people saying, I'm living out my own truth? This is an absurdity. So we really have to be on guard to say either a thing is or is not the thing that it purports to be. It can't be both.
Yeah, exactly. So is this principle number?
This is the second roadblock.
The second roadblock. Okay, not principle, roadblock number 2. And I would just add this gloss. The truth question is secondary. It's really fundamental, but it's secondary. Before you can say whether or not something is true, you're absolutely correct that there is a logical first principle, a logical axiom called the principle of contradiction that you define absolutely correctly. A thing can't both be and not be in the same way at the same time. And it is presupposed by what we designate when we say X proposition is true or not true. Like a lot of conservatives can reason their way to something can't be both. Something has to be true, but they don't understand that this requires the principle of contradiction, and the principle of contradiction can't be itself proven because it's so fundamental. It just must be true for everything else that we would ever wish to opine or propose. It must be the case. That's really, really, really foundational, and it's really foundational to Roman Catholicism as well. Islam proposes a God who is voluntarist, meaning his will precedes his intellect, and therefore the principle of contradiction does not bind God. Because we reject voluntarism, we say God's intellect is in some ontological way in front of his will, even though we believe in divine absolute simplicity. What this really requires is that in the end run is God does abide the principle of contradiction. So Muslims will say God can say rape is good one moment and not the next minute, or murder, pick your crime. And you see that in the Quran. In the Bible, God does not make something that's fundamentally good to be fundamentally bad. You can have contingent goods or evils, but something that is in itself good or bad can't be good or bad. And that's because we have an intellectual understanding of God rather than the voluntarist understanding of God. And like you say, the mark of this at the popular level, leave God out of it for a second, is that people say my truth or your truth, or, truth claims aren't objective. Mm-hmm. And this just means that they fundamentally have either they reject or they presupposed out of the equation, probably because of their modernist education, the idea of the principle of contradiction.
Right. And by that pathos, by that inculcated empathy, we've been conditioned to just let people have their own reality. This is a very bad sign if you feel like other people can have their own truths, or if you think that. It's horrendous. But Tim, you brought up first principles as something that you can't prove. It's something intuitive that you either apprehend and acquiesce to, or you don't. You accept or reject it. And this is small children know this is true. It requires a modern education to come to believe this isn't true, the first principle of all reality. And if we had hours and hours, we'd include all the first principles here, but we don't.